I don't think anyone anticipated that Putin would be so reckless and so vicious as to destroy Ukrainian cities. He was affected by bad ideas from Alexander Dugin. Punishing every person who's Russian makes no sense.
Hello, my name is Zygar, and every week I'm speaking with greatest minds of humanity, and my today's guest is Steven Pinker, one of the most popular philosophers and psychologists in the world. Hello, Steven. Thank you for your time. Let me start with mentioning your book that was written more than 10 years ago. It was called The Better Angels of Our Nation. In that book, you write that the violence has declined globally, and there is going to be so-called the long peace, and probably it's going to last. Has it changed your mind during the recent couple of weeks, couple of months after the war in Ukraine started?
Well, I didn't predict that it would necessarily last. I noted that it had happened. This was 10 years ago. One of the reasons that the invasion of Ukraine is such a shock is that it has gone against a long-standing situation since the end of World War II. Wars between countries, especially wars between developed countries, have been declining. They are, for the first time in history, illegal, according to signatories of the United Nations. You can't launch a war without approval of the Security Council or in self-defense. And no United Nations state has ever gone out of existence through conquest. So this is a shock. Putin has overturned a situation that had been in place for 77 years. This is, again, I didn't predict that it would last forever, but and we can hope that this is an aberration, that the punishment that Putin has received from the sanctions, from the disappointing military results, will restore the international order that had been in place. We're seeing that international order in that the conquest has not been accepted by other countries in the world, and the war has not been approved, and there are sanctions of punishment showing that this is not the way the world works anymore.
But actually, what could have gone wrong? There was no one who could have expected that. And in your book, you are praising all our civilization with its development and enlightenment and empathy and fight for human rights. That's our civilization of 21st century. And it could be considered as some kind of guarantee that developed countries would not wage wars against each other. And at the same time, Russia during all the last years, although being quite an authoritarian state, but still it looked like a member of global community and a highly developed country, and it did not look like a country, a nation that wanted to exclude itself from the global market and global culture.
Yeah, so ideas matter, and the fact that Putin himself subscribes to an anachronistic vision of international relations, one in which great empires are entitled to spheres of influence, that it is a right of theirs to have neighboring countries either aligned with them or even engulfed by them, regardless of the desire for self-determination of the peoples themselves. The idea that there is the civilizations or ethnic nations must compete against each other for preeminence, for dominance. They must rectify historic injustices, that pride and humiliation are major factors that should govern whether countries go to war or not. This has been, of course, that was true for most of human history, but most countries had moved beyond that to an idea where the purpose of nation states is to allow their citizens to flourish, to be healthy, happy, educated, prosperous, that a nation itself only has rights insofar as it's a vehicle for people to enjoy their lives, that other empires, such as the British Empire and the French Empire and the Dutch Empire, and before that the Swedish Empire, had happily contracted, said goodbye to many of their territories, and they didn't feel insulted, humiliated, like they had to get revenge. So the personality of Putin, kind of malignant narcissism, which he then unites with the image of his country, has led him to an action that is endangering millions of people. That is something that most countries have decided is just not the way that the world should do business anymore. So it truly is. He was affected by bad ideas from Alexander Dugin, from a long tradition that assigns glory and eminence and dominance and power to nations and holds that up as the ultimate goal in life. So that's part of it. Russia also, even though it is, of course, in some ways it's a developed state, but by some definitions, such as a standard one that have 20,000 US dollars per capita, GDP per capita, other than wealth extracted from the ground, oil and gas. In that sense, Russia is not a developed nation. That is, it does not have a wealth based on commercial infrastructure of trade and technology, but rather of just digging valuable stuff out of the ground. And that can be an exception to the rule that generally developed countries tend to avoid war.
Okay, on Twitter you recently wrote that Russia's use of tactical nuclear weapons would not automatically trigger retaliation in kind and would not start all-out nuclear war. And also you wrote that other responses are available. What could be the other responses? And actually, what the West could do to stop Russia from waging this war and probably to prevent the next war like this one?
Yeah, so those are two questions. Clearly, the retaliation for the use of a nuclear weapon, of course, is being kept secret because it's strategically wise not to show all of your options, all your cards, but to keep them secret until they have to be used, so that the adversary, in this case Russia, will fear the worst. But there are sanctions. There's still many sanctions that could be ramped up. There could be a complete shut-off of all oil and gas purchased from Russia. There could be a more of an armed response for Ukraine, or even by the NATO countries individually. So far, the NATO countries aren't fighting Russia directly, and they're very much trying to avoid that. But in the case of a crossing the line of a nuclear weapon being detonated, we just don't know what the response would be. But it doesn't necessarily have to be detonating a nuclear weapon in kind. Could be military, could be economic, could be diplomatic, even above and beyond what is being implemented now. And I think deliberately, the maximum possible sanctions are not being implemented now, precisely so that there is room to ramp them up should Russia escalate.
Do you think that it's probable or it's possible that Russia would use nuclear weapons?
It's unlikely, but it's not impossible. I think most observers think that it would only happen if there was a military threat likely to depose the Putin regime, and that itself is unlikely. The Ukraine, of course, does not have the capability of overthrowing the Putin regime, and NATO has no particular desire to do so.
We're speaking about Putin a lot, but we know that Putin is not the only leader to be constructing such an authoritarian state. I remember the last time we saw each other in person, that was in Vancouver in 2018, and you were delivering your TED Talk that time, and you mentioned several authoritarian states, Russia, China, and Venezuela, saying that they cannot be considered the examples of our Enlightenment age we live in.
That's an understatement, yes.
Yeah, and obviously Putin, like few other political leaders in the world, is living in the past. He is using the ideology not of the 21st century, but of 19th century or probably early 20th century, at least. Do you consider that such nationalist ideology and such way of thinking and living in the past could be spread among other global politicians, and that ideology of nationalism and populism could lead us to other bloody wars? And probably this war could open some kind of Pandora's box.
It could. I suspect it won't, but it could. The reason that I suspect it won't is that Putin and Russia have suffered for the invasion. It has not worked out well. It is not as if the world has said, okay, the game has changed. Now conquest by military expansion is okay. That's just not been the reaction of the world. Mm-hmm. Russia will come out of this. We don't know the ending, but it's certainly not going to come out more powerful, more affluent. So the lessons that the world will draw will not be, hey, conquest wasn't so bad after all. It really has not worked out well. It's also possible, and when I wrote Better Angels of Our Nature and then Enlightenment Now, which expanded the ideas of Better Angels to include not just violence, but also health and affluence and education and life experience. One of the fears I had is that as compared to, say, nationalism with a strong leader, which speaks to our primitive tribal and authoritarian instincts, liberal democracy, enlightened values, humanism, cosmopolitanism, it's an intellectual idea that I think makes us much better off. It doesn't get people, excited. People don't have rallies with colored shirts with a strong leader pounding his fist and getting people's blood pumping. However, ironically, the worldwide support for Ukraine and the revival of kind of tribal counterforce of solidarity with Ukraine, of a willingness to make sacrifices, people actually trying to join the fight in Ukraine against Russia, a reminder of what's so great about the liberal democracy and peace and international agreements. Tragically, the horrors of the war might get people excited about democracy and enlightened values again. I will not say that anything good can come out of this war. Nothing good will come out of it, but it may be possible that at least an appreciation, an emotional attachment to democracy, peace, international institutions could be revived.
Okay, and in recent article in The Guardian, I would quote, "You were named as the world's most prominent defender of the status quo." So you don't think that the current political elite, I mean global political elite, is partially responsible for what is happening right now, because they were appeasing Putin, they were in a way treating him, if not as an equal partner, but still they were not doing enough to stop him and prevent this war.
Yeah. By the way, I am the opposite of a defender of the status quo. I believe in progress. I believe that that whole point of progress is the status quo is not acceptable. We've got to keep improving things. So that is a complete mischaracterization. And it's ironic that someone who argues that that things have been getting better, can be getting better, should be accused of defending the status quo, because that's the exact opposite of the whole concept of progress. But as I say, people who call themselves progressive hate progress. They can't abide by the idea that our current institutions could find the means of continuing improvement and have some vague idea that maybe we should just tear it all down and start from something from scratch. I think we know from the history of the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, the Cambodian Revolution, what happened in Venezuela, that tearing things down and radically trying to start from the ground up is in general not a good idea. But you know, in the case of Putin, what could the people who tended to be sympathetic to Putin, ironically, were elements of the American right, most famously Donald Trump. And that is certainly not an example of the kind of progressive Enlightenment values that I have advocated. Trump, as an authoritarian nationalist populist, is a counter-Enlightenment figure. In terms of, say, Europe, which of course is, most countries have not been taken over by authoritarian populists. I think they made an error in becoming so dependent on Russian fossil fuels, Germany being the most prominent example, by stupidly shutting down their nuclear power plants. They made themselves more dependent on Russian oil and gas and were therefore unable to push back. But aside from that, certainly the democratic countries have pushed back against Putin since his annexation of Crimea and fomenting of separatist movements in eastern Ukraine and in Georgia. Russia was kicked out of the G8. It's back to the G7. There were sanctions starting in 2014 because the annexation of Crimea was itself a counterexample to the general trend that countries don't take over territory by force, by annexation. Could it have been stronger? Probably could have been stronger. I don't think anyone anticipated that Putin would be so reckless and so vicious as to destroy Ukrainian cities in a crazy effort to either absorb Ukraine or replace its democratically elected leader with a Russian puppet. That was extreme even by Putin's previous behavior.
Okay, thank you. And in your recent book, The Rationality, you question how come the same species, on the one hand, invents the COVID cure and the vaccine, and at the same time people refuse to take that medicine or reject vaccination, or at the same time they do not consider the threats of the climate change to be serious, having all those researches. And so how could you explain another phenomena that we're witnessing in Russia right now, where a lot of people prefer to believe state propaganda rather than their relatives in Ukraine, who tell them that there is a tragedy and there is a real massacre there, but at the same time people believe what TV channels say them, and they believe that that's a righteous war and that's the liberation of Ukraine.
I mean, partly it's brute force, namely that if they were to express anything else, they could go to jail. So that always helps in fostering propaganda. But there is a tendency for people to base beliefs outside their immediate experience. That is there a glass of water on the table in front of me? Is there food in the fridge? Is there petrol in the car? Where are the kids? People are pretty well attuned to reality. But things happening thousands of miles away or hundreds of years ago or at microscopic scales where they can't see it with their own eyes, people tend to get their information from institutions. We have no choice. I mean, I believe in a lot of scientific facts that I couldn't possibly prove myself. but I trust the scientists, my fellow scientists. If you don't trust your fellow scientists, if you don't trust your government, you will go with the institution that you're most affiliated with, that you have the most solidarity with.
Oh, actually, you say if you don't trust the government, but those people in Russia, they do trust the government.
They trust, yes, that's right. They trust they trust the wrong government. So what we have to do really is to scrutinize the institutions. That is, trust the ones that are open in how they arrive at their claims to the truth, starting with, do they punish people who disagree? And any institution that will punish someone for expressing disagreement has cut itself off from the truth, because no human is infallible. No one is an oracle. It's not that God speaks to any of us. We have to use methods of fact-finding, such as peer review and editing and fact-checking and free speech and open debate, so that if one person makes a false claim, someone else can point it out. The gathering of evidence. And what does not come naturally enough to us is the idea that truth is a rare and precious commodity. It can only be approached by institutions that have rules of open debate and criticism and fact-checking and review and editing. Aside from that, any institution will likely promote things that are false. Now, connecting our discussion of rationality with our discussion of tribalism and nationalism and authoritarianism, an overall theme in my writings, as someone who believes both in human nature and in progress, is that there is such a thing as human nature. It includes some highly irrational ways of thinking and feeling. We are influenced by anecdotes rather than data. We often see causation in kind of voodoo similarity or resemblance rather than in the laws of science. We trust in charismatic leaders as opposed to only giving power to people by rules and responsibilities and feedback to the people. So we're always being dragged back by these primitive forces of human nature. Some of our institutions have managed to carry us forward despite the limitations of human nature. Institutions like a free press, like democracy, like science, like record-keeping agencies. It's only if those institutions are strengthened and if people are reminded of their value that we can hope to make progress. When those institutions are disabled, then we have no reason to expect progress to continue.
Mm-hmm. Okay, do I get it right that human nature is very rigid, and actually any human being can become a barbarian, and like that, the evolution of mankind can be turned backwards? I know your personal story, that your grandmother survived the Chisinau pogrom back in 1903, and that city is rather close to the Ukrainian border. Yeah, sure. And the same Jewish pogroms happened in many Ukrainian cities, like in Odessa, for example. And what we're seeing right now in Ukraine, for example, in Bucha or in other cities, reminds of all those pogroms that happened more than 100 years ago. So, do you think that there was no change of that dark side of human nature?
Yeah, I wouldn't say, I think there is no change in human nature. There can be a change in human behavior because of the institutions of civilization and enlightenment. There's less crime because we have a police force. There's less war because we have an international regime that can impose sanctions and refuse to recognize conquest and condemn aggression. We have science because we have universities and labs and institutions with peer review and demands for empirical testing. So I wouldn't say so much that human nature is rigid, but that it exists and it composes many parts. So we have the capacity for empathy, we have the capacity for self-control, we have the capacity for moral norms, we have the capacity for problem solving because of our cognitive processes. So our behavior is tugged in different directions by different parts of the brain, and our institutions can foster the, as Abraham Lincoln put it, the better angels of our nature, which a phrase that I stole as the title of my book on the history of violence. I like the expression because it implies that there are other angels, darker angels, that it is consistent with my view of human nature as a complex system of many parts. It's a question of empowering the parts of human nature that increase knowledge, increase health, increase happiness, increase peace, reduce violence, reduce war.
Mm-hmm. Okay, a couple of years ago, you were one of the prominent intellectuals who signed so-called Harper's letter that was perceived to be also a letter against cancel culture. And that was quite an important message, and it was widely discussed all over the world, in Europe, in Russia as well. So now, after 2 years have passed, do you consider cancel culture to be a bigger threat to the Western culture, or do you think that that's a new form of censorship?
What do you expect to? How do you expect this phenomenon to be transformed?
I think it is a threat in that, like repressive authoritarian governments, including current Russia, former Soviet Union, the repression of opinion means that you have turned off the only means that our species has of discovering truth. Because again, none of us is infallible. We don't hear the voice of God, of the angels telling us the truth. We do our best, we try things out. No one gets it right all the time. It's only if ideas can be criticized that we have any hope of approaching the truth. And so the atmosphere in universities, in newspapers, in media outlets, in institutions, that certain opinions should be punished, that people could lose their jobs, they can be called racists or transphobes just for expressing an opinion, and therefore their reputation unfairly damaged, means that we are less likely to increase knowledge. We're more likely to fall into error and superstition and dogma and orthodoxy. So I do think it is a serious development. I don't think it has improved in the last 2 years. Although there is more recognition of it. There are organizations that are trying to push back and defend the ideals of free speech and free thought. And I hope that they will be able to successfully push back.
Actually, do you think that that trend might be reversible, or as a consequence of the new technological revolution and new social media culture, when much more people have an opportunity to have their voices heard, and much more people who did not consider themselves to be privileged in the past or part of the elite now can feel that they can influence and they can make the elites have their voices heard. And as a result of that new technological era, that might not be reversed. And that would be the new new normality, the new form of how intellectuals would communicate.
Yeah, there is a part of the phenomenon of suppressing speech, ironically, comes from a medium that was supposed to open up speech. That is, whereas 25 years ago, people said the problem is that, as the bumper sticker said, freedom of the press goes to those who own one. And the problem was there was a oligopoly of media channels, of CNN and the New York Times, and that ordinary people could not have their opinions broadcast. Now they can, and ironically, one of the consequences has been attempts to shut down speech, possibly because the positive feedback loops in social media of liking things that are popular, which make them more popular, or sharing things which make them easy to share, means that it's easy to whip up a mob that can intimidate a speaker and or get them fired or shamed. And ironically, they have contributed to cancel culture. It's not the only thing that's behind the new repression, because it has been going on for a while. The fears that political correctness are suppressing speech were expressed more than 30 years ago, but social media may have accelerated them. Could there be a pushback? I think there could be. There's some of the repression may be a case of what's sometimes called pluralistic ignorance. That is, everyone thinks that everyone else thinks something, even if they don't think it. And you can easily get pluralistic ignorance when there is repression of speech, when there is punishment. You can, though, have a little boy saying the emperor has no clothes, that if there are courageous people who are willing to say what might be on people's minds, there can be a pushback. Since it is often activists who whip up mobs with the help of social media that may be imposing a minority opinion on a majority, it's important that there be organizations that bring people together on the other side and push back. In the last couple of years, we have seen a number of them rise up. There's the Heterodox Academy. There's the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism. There's the British organization Counterweight. There's the Alliance for Academic Freedom. There's the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. So at least now there are organizations that can counter the mobs that tend to form on social media and often influence people in power, such as newspaper editors and university presidents and rectors.
There is some kind of new phenomena that is being widely discussed in Russia, and it is a consequence of the war in Ukraine. There is a lot of prejudice against all people with Russian passports, those who stay in the country, and those artists or writers or journalists who have left. And that phenomena is broadly discussed in Europe and also is used by Russian propaganda as well. And it's being called some new form of cancel culture, but some kind of attempt of canceling Russian culture. Do you think that is possible, that is justified, and is that repression against Russians would last long?
Yeah, I think it's a terrible idea, because individuals should not be punished because of their national origin. Most Russian artists, scientists, intellectuals, writers, or even many citizens, it's not their fault that Putin made this decision. And punishing them, I think, as opposed to institutions, I think is a terrible idea. As you say, it can be used as propaganda. It's unfair, and it's the wrong tactic. I think the Russian government should be punished for breaking this international rule, just as anyone should be punished for breaking a rule in an organization they belong to. In this case, the Community of Nations. But punishing every person who's Russian makes no sense.
Okay, and speaking about your latest book, you discussed a lot the question of conspiracy theories and how they affect people and how irrationally people believe in conspiracy theories. And now we have a war that is actually caused by a huge conspiracy theory. And most Russians believe that that was NATO and United States that were going to attack Russia. So that's why they consider this war to be justified. Do you think that it's possible to do something to prevent people from believing in conspiracy theories? Or is it also a part of human nature to fall into that irrationality?
Well, it is. I think it is part of human nature, but fortunately, there are other parts of human nature, and one of them is when there is exchange of ideas, you can hear a crazy idea being called crazy. It's when you're punished, when someone is punished for saying that an idea is crazy, that the idea can, a crazy idea can become entrenched. So it is. That was an insane conspiracy theory. There's like not even the slightest evidence that NATO had any interest in invading Russia the way Napoleon or Hitler did. And it is a kind of paranoid conspiracy theory that, as you know, has had terrible consequences. How can conspiracy theories be combated? Well, certainly, open exchange of ideas helps. I don't think we have a formula for refuting them. I think often when people see that other people they trust defect from a conspiracy theory, they scoff at it. That can influence them because often belief in conspiracy theories is a kind of social solidarity. It's a way of expressing closeness to people that you value or trust. If there are prominent people who disavow it, a conspiracy theory, that makes it less, that can make it less attractive. But yeah, we don't, I don't think we have a formula that is guaranteed to pull people away from these conspiracy theories.
Okay, in your book, in your recent book, The Rationality, you also say that somehow people who make wrong choices should be constrained by their friends or by the government to make the right choices. Don't you think that that's a quick path to some much more authoritarian, autocratic system?
Is there?
Well, it is a fear, and the libertarian movement often worries that any kind of government regulation or paternalism will be a kind of slippery slope to authoritarianism. There's the famous book by Friedrich Hayek, The Road to Serfdom. We can look to history and suggest that that is not what happens, that the welfare states and heavily regulated states of Western Europe and the former British Commonwealth like New Zealand and Canada and Australia, they haven't slid down into autocracy. Autocracies generally come when there is some armed insurrection or gang of fanatics who take over the government by force. There can be too much government regulation. There can be too little government regulation. But I think history shows that it is not an inevitable slide into autocracy. In the case of the nudging, as it's sometimes called, that is the term suggested by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein, the idea is not to apply coercion. So an example would be, how do you get people to agree to allow their organs to be donated if they are in an accident and they have a fatal accident, but their kidneys are still usable or their heart. The idea is that if instead of having to sign a form that says, yes, it's okay to harvest my organs if I die, instead the default, the background case is that your organs can be harvested, but you have to fill out a form to say, no, they can't be. There's no coercion. No one is forced to agree to give up their organs. But many more people do just because of human laziness. So it's a way of capitalizing on laziness in a sense, without overt coercion.
Okay, and maybe the last question I've got for you. For many years, you've been considered as one of the most optimistic scientists. And with all those influential celebrities admiring your work, like Bill Gates telling that your books are the most inspiring inspiring books that he has ever read, or Mark Zuckerberg or Bill Clinton praising your works. So can you share your new perspective about how the world right now could be developed? What are the perspectives for our world that look to be quite enlightened on the one hand, but on the other hand, a lot of people have reasonable doubts that there is much progress, and it looks like our enlightenment has stumbled.
Yeah, I actually don't consider myself an optimist. What I have done, which people confuse with optimism, is plot data on human progress. Namely, we really do live longer than our ancestors. We fight fewer wars. We're richer. We're better educated. We have more leisure time. We are happier on average. Now, these are facts that most people are unaware of because they get their understanding of the world from the news. Now, the news is a highly non-random sample of the worst things happening in the world on any given day. The beneficial trends, the progress, consist either in things that don't happen, countries that don't go to war, or things that ramp up gradually, just a few percentage points a year, but accumulate. And so there's never a Thursday in October in which it makes a headline. And so my point is simply that basing your understanding of the world on the news means that you'll be misinformed. You will just not understand, not see the progress that has been made. Now, it's not the same as optimism. It's not the same as saying the expectation that things necessarily will get better, but it does increase your confidence.
No, I haven't said that you were satisfied with that. I say that you were optimistic about it.
Well, I just want people to recognize that it exists.
Yeah.
People aren't aware that it exists. People in opinion polls get the answers wrong as to whether more people are vaccinated, fewer children die, there are fewer wars. People are just ignorant because the news makes you ignorant compared to data. Now, what it does, the way that it opens up a window for optimism is to say, well, if we did it in the past, why can't we continue to do it? Now, that is not a guarantee that we will. People may turn away from the things that cause progress, such as science, such as freedom of speech and freedom of the press, such as liberal democracy, such as international organizations, such as markets, regulated markets. If they do, then progress won't necessarily continue. The point is to try to understand what has led to progress and to do more of it. Not to accept the status quo. That's the opposite of progress. Progress means you're not satisfied with the status quo, but a rational, scientifically informed progress would ask the question with an open mind, what has made us better off? What makes us worse off? Let's not repeat our mistakes. Let's try to figure out what has led to the progress that has given us advantages so far. Do more of that.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you. Do subscribe for my YouTube channel and wait for the next interview next week.